I'm Alina Vasquez, and I'm 36. My mom texted me for the first time in 10 months, 9 days after my cybersecurity startup made headlines with a $940 million valuation. No question marks, no congrats, no excuses, just a summons similar to how you would recall a faulty product for a family meal. My parents ruined my first business 10 years ago and gave my sister all of my clients. The whole village was informed that I had left. They handed the potatoes and went on, giving the impression that I had abandoned 40 customers with a boilerplate letter. I wasn't angry when I received the SMS. Since none of them realized that I had been planning for that supper since November, I felt something colder and much more beneficial. None of them anticipated what I brought into my parents' dining room that evening or what I signed at that table in front of my whole family. Neither my mother nor my father, and most definitely not my sister. Welcome back to Inheritance Chronicles, where families discover the real value of silent women who eventually speak the truth. You've come to the correct spot if you like tales about getting up without yelling. This one begins with a loan and concludes with a signature, so please leave a comment below and be sure to subscribe. My Denver office smelled like champagne at 9 in the morning on the day the valuation was public. A printout of the headline had been pasted to the conference room's glass wall by someone. I started Kestrel Ridge Security from a studio apartment beside the railroad tracks, and it is today worth more than all the companies in my hometown put together. Tom Ackheffer, my chief operations officer, came knocking on my door with a smile and 2 coffees. "The founder's story is what reporters want," he remarked. "Tenacious Ohioan girl. They adore that stuff." I said something suitable while grinning. 9 days later, I was staring at the message displayed under my mother's name on my phone. Supper with the family. No justifications. It's important, therefore I want to be clear about things. I was never formally cut off by my family. They would have had to acknowledge that anything had occurred. Rather, my mother signed Christmas cards with her flawless looping hand, "Love, Mom and Dad," for 10 years. She phoned for precisely one courteous discussion about cholesterol and the weather on each birthday before hanging up before anything real could happen. My father never gave me a call. They didn't reject me. They just marked me down in the same manner that my father at his office equipment firm marked down merchandise that had been damaged by water. No longer worth full price, still on the shelf. I was now valued at $940 million by the market. And just as planned, my mother arrived. Tom inquired about my well-being. I told him how wonderful I was. The folder in my bottom drawer had been prepared since November, so for once it was accurate. They had read the boxes. The documents were written. I had been anticipating an invitation from my family since November. They just wanted an excuse to have me back at the table. I have to take you back to Dayton, Ohio, in 2013, when I was 23 years old and foolish enough to believe that competence and safety were synonymous, to describe what was in those crates. I had just left a respectable corporate position to launch Lockup IT security out of my rental duplex's garage. My first customer was a tiny legal practice that had a Friday afternoon ransomware attack. I spent 30 hours working on their case, keeping track of every step and charging them a reasonable amount. They sobbed, made the payment, and informed 2 additional businesses. That was my whole marketing strategy, a paper trail and word of mouth. Back then, I chronicled everything. Every call, every modification, each signature. Documentation is the difference between an incident and a disaster in my line of work. I never would have imagined that this practice would ultimately save my life. My family paid particular attention to all of this. It had never really been a dining table. There was gravy in the boardroom. Hayes Office Systems, copiers, printers, 3 sites, and service contracts were owned by my father, Frank Hayes. He also conducted a quarterly evaluation of the family every Sunday. Meredith, my 4-year-old sister, sat at his right hand and handled marketing for him. The line item that hadn't yet been executed was me. The bank flatly rejected me when Lockup began to expand, and I needed operating cash to employ. 23 years old, no collateral and no company credit history. I recall completing uncooperative math while sitting in the bank's parking lot, and I recall my father grinning at me from across the pot roast that Sunday in a manner he had never done before. $150,000 was the offer, and I want you to know that I wasn't naive. The documents, a convertible note, were created by my dad's attorney. If the loan was not repaid, the debt might turn into ownership of my business. Every page was read by me. I then hired my own attorney, a downtown lady, for $400. I hardly needed to reread it. The conversion clause caught her attention. She pointed to the acceleration clause, which allowed the lender to demand the full amount up front. Standard language may become personal when it comes to family, she added. I therefore engaged in negotiation. I was able to get a repurchase, add an early repayment option, and fully clear the debt. I'm going to utilize it quickly. I already knew how to get out of any unfriendly network when I took out the debt. Family money stays warm, my father wrote as he signed with his fine pen. Carol, my mother, refreshed everyone's coffee and remarked on how good it was that the daughters had returned to the family company. Because I corrected her, I can still clearly recall the precise words. Lockep wasn't owned by the family, I owned it. Of course, honey, she answered, grinning as she did at church. I took note of it, of course. That evening, I really recorded it in the notebook where I kept track of open things, just as I would record an oddity that I was still unable to understand. I then left for work. I repaid $90,000 of that debt ahead of time throughout the course of the next 2 years, receipt after receipt. I had a September payment date and owed $60,000 by the spring of 2016. Another 4 months. All I needed was that. My dad definitely remembered that number. By 2015, Lockep was the peaceful center of a community like Dayton, with 9 staff members, around 40 clients on retainer, legal businesses, medical offices, and a school system. Dale Mercer, a veteran Air Force records clerk who alphabetized like it was a religion, was the office manager I recruited. You could audit the paper trail between the two of us in that office while wearing a blindfold. My sister, meanwhile, took up a pastime. Meredith began coming to my office with her phone out to take photos for the social media sites of the Hayes office systems. One comment on a picture of my server rack said, "Our family's tech arm." I calmly and openly stated that Lockep was a separate business. She removed it and called me theatrical. My dad ran my figures aloud like an auditor at Sunday dinner, and I responded as it would have been more expensive to refuse than to comply. I heard him boast about me at the golf course, but I always remembered the words as our tiny security store. An hour. I also filed that term in the notepad. This is what people don't tell you about being the most competent member of a family like mine. Success does not provide you autonomy. It increases the value of your evaluation. My dad discovered a new religion at the end of that year, a strip mall development in Springfield that a golf friend said was a must-see. Dad carved the roast and added, "Safe as bricks." He contributed money, the amount of which I was still unsure, and my mother expressed how thrilling everything was. Meredith then raised a glass to him. At least it wasn't my issue. I recall thinking with the smugness of a 25-year-old contract reader. It's almost comical. The breach always begins someplace you're not looking in my line of business. Early in 2016, the strip mall began to devour him. Costs soared and permits were delayed. It turned out that his companion was more skilled at golf than building. The majority of information was eventually revealed to me by my Aunt Ruth and bank records. However, by that spring, the losses were approaching $700,000, and my father had discreetly pledged Hayes Office Systems cash flow against it. During Sunday dinner, my mother started saying things like, "We're all tightening our belts while serving the same roast on the same china." The most bizarre action of all then occurred. During this period of bleeding, my dad put Meredith in charge of a brand new business called Boland Hayes Group, which marketed and handled IT services. Her husband Doug's name appeared next to hers on the papers. Suddenly, my sister was working in the IT services industry, despite her inability to distinguish between a firewall and a space heater. My intuition informed me of the reality my brain didn't want to hear after I sat with the statement for a week. I was unable to provide any evidence. So far, there was nothing to prove. However, I am aware of what staging entails. Attackers in my line of business set up their infrastructure before they even come into contact with you, so I took action. I rescheduled my payout date by calling my dad's attorney. I collected most of the remaining $60,000 and scheduled the payout for the first week of September. Additionally, I made one little mistake that would cost me everything. His staff returned me the note's insurance documentation and a standard modification in March, asking me to sign the signature page and return it. The amendment was read by me. It was tidy. I sent a single piece of paper with my name written on it in blue ink. Just one page. Do you recall that page? 8 weeks before my planned payout, on July 11th, 2016, the letter from my father's attorney came via certified mail. The acceleration clause was being used by the note holder. The remaining $60,000 must be paid in full within 10 days. The note would become a controlling ownership position in lockstep IT security if payment was not made in full. I stood in my mailbox and read it 3 times. I then gave my dad a call. On the 4th ring, he picked up and spoke to me like reading minutes off a tape. Fiduciary prudence and market circumstances. Stella, nothing personal. Paper is just paper. Dad, I have the money scheduled for September, I responded. You are aware of this. We're going on a date. The message was not need to wait, he added. He was correct, too. Nobody tells you about that portion. The right to call the loan is completely on the opposite side of the table, so the borrower may do everything early and still lose. Those 10 days seemed like a fight to me. I returned to my bank, followed by 2 more banks and finally a credit union. In 10 days, no one crosses $60,000 for a 26-year-old. I offered to pay the $60,000 plus interest and a penalty. The response from his attorney was a single, succinct sentence. I will always remember how the note holder chose the conversion election as if it were a civic obligation. I sent what I had as a partial payment in good faith on day 10. The next morning, it was given back. Additionally, my key spun pointlessly in the lock on Monday when I went to my own workplace at 7 in the morning with the intention of continuing to battle from my desk. Over the weekend, they had modified it. I could see that Dale had already cleaned his desk through the glass. 20 minutes were spent on the shareholder meeting. My dad, who owns 60% of my business, sat at the head of the meeting, which took place in the conference room I had equipped at a table I had purchased at a liquidation sale. The resolutions were read by his attorney. First, remove Stella Hayes from her position as CEO. The second item was to designate Meredith Hayes Boland as the acting president. My sister did not glance at me. She had never worked a security event before. As I observed her highlight something on a legal pad, I instantly grasped the whole architecture. The time, the 10 days, and the new agency. This loan had not gone sour. It had been a harvest. I knew there was nothing left to win in the room, so I didn't say anything. After it was over, my dad walked around the table, gently placed his hand on my shoulder like a doctor breaking terrible news, and spoke the words that have been stuck in my brain for 10 years. Sweetheart, it was never yours. For the family, you just ran it. He had good intentions. That's what still stops me. In the same manner that other men believe in the weather, he did. My mother was collecting the meeting papers at the far end of the table and putting them into a tidy square stack. And she didn't say anything. Nothing. The one thing I've ever been good at is recording what's left. So I drove back to my leased duplex and sat on the floor between 14 boxes of my office supplies, inventorying them box by box. The first email from a customer I had worked with for 3 years came in 2 weeks later. It said, "You could have at least said goodbye in person instead of a form letter." I gazed at the screen. What form letter? After asking that customer to provide me with hat he had received, I requested several additional clients. In contrast to the shareholder meeting, what was returned made me sick to my stomach. They were referred to as client transition letters, and they were dated the week after the takeover and written on lockstep letterhead. They all said that I, Stella Hayes, was willingly handing over all service contracts to Boland Hayes Group. Even though I had never seen them before, I signed each one and thanked the customer for their confidence. My skin turned cold as I brought out the signature and placed it next to my own one. I owned it. Just the same rather packed S. The Y has the same tail. One piece of paper that spring contained a flawless scan of a signature I had previously signed in blue ink. The insurance amendment is a neat, uninteresting one-page document. 40 farewell letters had my name imprinted on them after they had stolen my signature sheet. And all of Dayton's clients thought I had personally given them to my sister and left without giving them a call. 40 letters were sent in handwritten envelopes throughout the same week. This is the detail that I was unable to let go of. The one that, for years, kept me up at night. Those envelopes had meticulous, tidy, looping handwriting. The kind of penmanship that doesn't smear any of the 200 Christmas cards it addresses each December. That hand was familiar to me. All my childhood, I had seen it on permission forms and lunch bags. Even by myself in my vehicle, I wasn't ready to speak it out just yet. However, I took pictures of each letter the customer sent me, recorded them in a folder, and gave that folder the name Lockep. Let it open. An old habit. Items that are open ultimately shut. That August, I brought what I had to a lawsuit lawyer. In a way, it was made worse by her kindness. According to her, charges of fraud and forgery are legitimate, but they need verifiable proof. Client-forwarded photocopies would not suffice. I would want the original correspondence, the master files, and the internal communications that indicate who placed what orders. All of it was located in Lockep's file room and on Lockep's servers, and I was no longer legally permitted to enter that space. The only person who could have known where the remains were filed, Dale Mercer, was fired the week before the takeover and relocated to Florida to be closer to his grandchildren. A lawsuit would need 6 figures, which I lacked. A courthouse in a county where my father had supported the youth baseball league for 20 years, and 2 years I couldn't spare. On photocopies, she added, you'd be suing your dad in his own town. The arithmetic made sense to me. I'd want to tell you that I was furious about it, but you've probably experienced something similar yourself, so you are familiar with its form. Certain doors click rather than bang. The tale had already solidified like concrete across the community. Frank Hayes, poor guy, saving his flighty daughter's business, and she paid him back by departing town and giving her customers to her sister. She said to my Aunt Ruth, my mother heard that version at church every Sunday. She never once corrected it. We don't discuss family business, using the tone she reserved for resolved disputes. My account balance that October was $3,200. I bought a one-way ticket to Denver, packed 2 suitcases, and took exactly one thing from the wreckage of Lockep. The whiteboard from my old garage office, the one with my first network diagram still ghosted into the surface. Denver didn't care whose daughter I was, which made it the most honest place I'd ever lived. I rented a studio apartment next to the freight tracks, close enough that the freight train at 2 a.m. became my alarm for finishing incident reports. For 2 years, I worked contract incident response, the graveyard shifts nobody wanted, hospitals and credit unions calling at midnight with their systems on fire. It turns out that being methodically, obsessively documented is a superpower in a crisis. Clients started asking for me by name. In 2018, with 2 engineers who trusted me more than I trusted anyone, I founded Kestrel Ridge Security. A kestrel is a small falcon that hovers dead still in high wind before it strikes. I didn't pick the name by accident. I built the company the way a burned patient builds a house, every wire inspected twice. I took no money from anyone I loved. I read every term sheet 3 times and then paid 2 different lawyers to read it behind me. When investors pushed for control provisions, I walked away from term sheets. My own board thought I was crazy to refuse. One of my engineers joked that I ran the company like everyone was already breaching us. He wasn't wrong. 10 years in this industry taught me that every disaster begins with somebody extending trust on autopilot. And I had made my last autopilot deal at 23. In the back of every one of those decisions sat a folder that moved with me from laptop to laptop, never deleted, never opened more than once a year. Locked. Open items. I wasn't building a lawsuit. The lawyer had cured me of that fantasy. I honestly couldn't have told you what I was keeping it for. In my experience, you log first and understand later. Kestrel Ridge grew the way trust grows. Slowly and then suddenly, we landed a state government contract in 2019, our Series A in 2020, and a Series C in 2024 that put us in the national trade press. Somewhere in there, a Dayton business journal ran a local girl makes good piece, and my mother mailed me the clipping with a post-it that said, "We always knew you had it in you." I sat with that note for a long time. We always knew. The same people who had repriced me to zero were now claiming founder shares in my comeback. My dad never called. Not when we hit 100 employees. Not when I gave a keynote in Las Vegas that ended up on YouTube. I learned about the family's fortunes sideways through my Aunt Ruth's phone calls, which were short, dry, and more honest than every Christmas card my mother ever sent combined. Hayes Office Systems was shrinking because the print business was dying everywhere. And Boland Hayes Group, the agency built on my 40 clients, was slowly starving. It turns out clients acquired by letter can be lost the same way. The school district left, then the hospital network. Then in 2023, the anchor client whose retainer paid Meredith's payroll left. My sister had renamed the firm Boland Group, dropped the Hay, taken bank loans to cover payroll, and by 2025, the whole thing was leaning like a shed in the wind. I want to be honest with you about what I felt hearing that because this channel is about telling the truth quietly. I felt no joy. Those were my clients once, and my old employees were still in that building. 12 of them people I had hired and trained and lost custody of. If you've ever watched somebody mismanage the thing that used to be yours, a house, a business, a mother's recipe, you know that particular ache. And if you know it, tell me about it in the comments because I read them and I know I'm not the only one who's carried this. Then in October of 2025, my attorney Priya Anand called me with a sentence that changed the weather. Your sister's company just showed up on a distressed asset list. Priya laid it out like a weather report. The bank was calling Boland Group's loans. A liquidation was on the table within the quarter. Assets sold, leases broken, staff scattered. She expected me to say something about my sister. Instead, I asked the only question that mattered to me. Priya, in a liquidation, what happens to the company's records? There was a pause while she recalibrated. Retained for the legally required period, she said, then destroyed under the document retention policy. Shredded, wiped, gone. I closed my eyes and saw a file room I had never visited in a building I had never entered. D holding the only original copies of 40 letters I never signed. Ed plus the old lockstep email server that Boland had absorbed in 2016, along with everything else. The proof of what my family did to me was sitting in my sister's failing company, and it was about to be fed into a shredder by a bank that had no idea what it had. There are moments when 10 years of vague patient waiting collapses into a single decision that takes 4 seconds. I want to buy it, I said. Not the letters, the company. Priya, to her permanent credit, asked exactly one question. As Kestrel Ridge, no, as Quarry Creek Holdings, a private vehicle with my money and none of my name on the surface, buying distressed assets from a motivated bank. It's common, it's legal, and it's anonymous. By November, the deal closed. Quarry Creek acquired 70% of Boland Group for $1. $6 million plus a $400,000 bridge loan to stabilize payroll. 34 jobs, including 12 people I once hired myself. Meredith kept her 30% and her title, and had no idea who owned the other end of her lifeline. The document boxes arrived in Denver on a Tuesday. Ownership gave us the right to review company records. So, The archive came to us on a freight pallet, 41 boxes wrapped in plastic. I told my team I'd handle the review of the legacy files personally, which raised no eyebrows because I always handle things personally. It was a Saturday. The office was empty. I found it in the second hour, third row, a gray banker's box with a printed label reading Client Transitions 2016. I stood there looking at it for a while before I touched it. Then I did what I do at every incident scene. I put on nitrile gloves. I set up a camera, and I photographed the box from every angle before opening it because chain of custody is a religion and I am devout. On the inside of the lid, someone had stuck a yellow post-it note. The adhesive was gone, brittle with age, 9 years old and still legible. Use the March signature page. FH. I know my father's handwriting the way you know a voice through a wall. The left-leaning slant, the hard cross on the H, this was the hand that signed my report cards and my birthday checks, instructing someone to take a page with my name on it and put it to work. Under that post-it lay the originals, all 40 letters, crisp, never creased, each one carrying the same scanned signature. My signature tilted a fraction of a degree off true on every single copy, the same digital ghost stamped 40 times. I photographed each letter front and back. My hands were steady, which surprised me. And then at the bottom of the box, beneath the letters, I found something the label hadn't promised. A rubber-banded stack of spare envelopes, pre-addressed and never mailed. The handwriting on them was not my father's. I had known that handwriting since before I could read it. Neat, looping, patient. The hand that addressed 200 Christmas cards every December, that wrote "so proud of you" in my high school graduation card, D that labeled the freezer meals when I had my tonsils out. My mother had addressed the envelopes, not one or two, helping out at the kitchen table without asking questions. There were spares. You make spares when you're doing a mailing carefully, when you plan for mistakes, when you intend for every single one to arrive. For 10 years, I had told myself a survivable story. Dad did this, and Mom just failed to stop it the way she failed to stop him from anything. That story died on a Saturday afternoon in an empty office in Denver, wearing gloves, holding proof that my mother had personally licked the stamps on my execution. It was never yours, sweetheart. His sentence, but her postage. The old locked email server gave up the rest. In a backup folder, I found a message from my dad's account to the office manager's queue. Short and unbothered. Use the March signature page. Stella will understand someday. I sat with that word someday for a long time. Then I called Dale Mercer in Florida. He's in his 70s now. When I told him what I was holding, he was quiet. And then this Air Force records clerk who never once broke alphabetical order started to cry on the phone. He'd forwarded himself that email in 2016. He said the day before they walked him out because it didn't smell right and somebody ought to keep a copy of things. He sent an affidavit that week, voluntarily notarized. So now I had everything, every original, every email, a witness. The only question left was the one no evidence can answer. What was it all for? I'll tell you the part I'm not proud of because you deserve the whole ledger. One night in December, alone with a glass of wine I didn't drink, I opened a blank memo and let the coldest version of myself type. It came out fluent. Terminate the managing director. Call the $400,000 bridge loan. Wind the company down. Sell the client book. Let the bank pick the bones and mail my parents a copy of the forgery file with no note. Postmarked Denver. Total elapsed time, maybe 90 days. Total cost to me, nothing. I read that memo twice, and the second time through I heard it. The voice, nothing personal. Paper is paper. The note holder elects conversion. I had written my father's greatest hits in my own font. That's the trap nobody warns you about when your family runs on a ledger. The ledger doesn't care which side of it you're standing on. It just wants to keep being the language everyone speaks, and I had spoken it fluently on the first try. Somewhere in me, his arithmetic was installed and running, and revenge would just be me doing his bookkeeping with better software. I deleted the memo. I'd like to say it felt noble. Mostly it felt like pulling a fish hook out of my own palm. slow and backwards and necessary. But deleting a plan is not the same as having one. I knew what I wasn't willing to do. I had no idea yet what I was going to do, and the boxes sat in my office like an unexploded thing. It was Priya who finally put her finger on the fork in the road. We were reviewing the acquisition one evening when she looked at me over her glasses and asked, "Stella, do you want justice or do you want a verdict? Since the time frame for verdicts has long since closed." She guided me through it in the same manner as I guide customers during an irreversible breach. A civil fraud suit must normally be filed within 4 years under Ohio law, and mine was filed in 2016. She said that since the victim could not have rationally understood, there is a discovery rule argument. However, I had seen reproductions of those letters within weeks of the takeover, so a defense attorney would likely prevail if he claimed that my time limit began 10 years ago. Charges of criminal forgery were both practically unrealistic and theoretically feasible. With the statute of limitations issues piled on top, no county prosecutor was going to reopen a 10-year-old family paper dispute involving the guy who supported youth baseball for 20 years. Priya remarked, "I don't want you to spend hope on it, but I can have a specialist double-check the timing math." I didn't. I know when a system cannot be recovered because I have read enough post-event reports, and there it was. I had to swallow it whole. No courtroom on earth could consider the comprehensive, exquisite forensic evidence I now had of what had been done to me. There was just one power remaining in the evidence. In front of the particular individuals who had spent 10 years believing the lie, not the whole public or a jury, it may make the truth stand up straight. If I closed my eyes and passed the potatoes, I could see the jury that mattered, which had always been smaller than that. In front of the whole family at that dinner table on Marlowe Street, my father's version of me had been tried and found guilty, with my mother seconding the move. There was a pot roast in the center of any courtroom that still had jurisdiction over my case. "What do you really desire, then?" The week we closed the acquisitions books, Priya asked me. I can't draft in the direction of a sensation. I heard myself say that before I had given it any thought as I gazed out at the mountains. It's not something I want back. I want it to be true. After a moment of silence, she said, "Then decide what you're willing to pay for true. It's rarely free." That question turned out to be a load-bearing wall, because as soon as I imagined the truth landing, actually landing on that table in front of those faces, I could also see the shrapnel pattern. And standing directly in it were 34 people who had done nothing to me. The Bolus Group employees had not forged anything, and 12 of them were my own people from the lockup days, and a paycheck is a paycheck. If the truth exploded, the company would lose its jobs. I was outraged by the math. Priya seemed more perplexed by the second task I gave her than by the first. I requested that she look at employee ownership trusts, how to convert a private business such that its employees own the equity, how quickly the paperwork could be completed, and how cleanly it could be completed for a company that size. "You recently purchased this business," she remarked cautiously. "You also want to know how I can give it away." Nevertheless, I instructed her to draft it and store it in a drawer, and I was unable to adequately explain why. Not even to me, not quite yet. 2 weeks later, rumors that Kestrel Ridge was about to end its Series D began to circulate in the trade press. Headlines started arriving, and they quickly made their way to Ohio. In March 2026, Series D came to an end. At a $940 million valuation, $128 million was raised. And I laughed when I saw my face beneath the term empire on the main page of the financial press. Empires are inherited, and I had constructed mine out of a studio apartment with a train for an alarm clock. My phone turned into a gambling machine. I hadn't spoken to my high school friends in 15 years. I am cordially invited to speak at the annual luncheon of the Dayton Chamber of Commerce. There was no reference to the years that their members had exchanged tales about my abandonment of my customers. I gave a courteous response and made no commitments. And one day, 3 days, 5 days of stillness from the White House on Marlowe Street. It will take 7 days, I informed Priya. My estimate was inaccurate. Hunger takes time to present itself as an invitation, and my father has never once allowed himself to seem hungry. 9 days passed. The headline was still plastered to the conference room window when my phone began to vibrate on Tuesday morning, the 10th. It was located underneath the contact photo. Since 2014, my mother has not changed. Supper with the family. No justifications. This takes us back to the beginning of this tale. However, you now know what I was aware of, standing with champagne in the conference room. I didn't have any alcohol. You are aware of the gray box marked Client Transitions 2016 in my office. You are aware of the ownership documents dozing in Priya's drawer, the Florida affidavit, the post-it note in my father's hand, and the envelopes in my mother's. A number with 9 zeros had reunited me with my family, and they were asking me to supper. They believed they were arranging the table. I was, too. 2 nights later, my Aunt Ruth contacted me on her personal phone from her vehicle, where my family has always had open discussions. Ruth, a 71-year-old retired school principal with a voice like a wood rasp, is my father's elder sister. Her only allegiance is to the truth, and it has cost her precisely what one could anticipate. "It's not a dinner," she added, omitting the greeting. "There's a ham at the board meeting. For the last week, Frank has been informing the cousins that the family companies are reuniting. It has been mandated that Meredith deliver a presentation. A poster board presentation or something else entirely, Stella. Even while I knew what he wanted from me, I still asked. Cash, my dear. Boland Group has been in the bank's sight since the autumn. He will ask you to purchase your sister's business after getting up with his drink and discussing family. Keep the cash in its proper place." I almost burst out laughing. I had owned the business since November, and my father was going to officially ask me to buy it. You might have served the dramatic irony with the ham. Ruth's voice then became older and softer. "He's not creating this playbook, you know. In 1987, when I decided to sell my portion of the hardware businesses and pursue my degree, your grandpa threw me this identical supper. The meal is the same, but the table is different. I was the self-centered person who refused to support family. At that table, no one questioned what he had stolen from me initially. She ignored it. Don't enter that home by yourself the way I did, regardless of what you're planning. I can tell. I assured her that I wouldn't be by myself. 40 witnesses would be brought in a gray box by me. I spread out 2 cases like surgical trays on my dining room table the night before I took out. In less than 10 minutes, the evidence, 40 original letters in archival sleeves, the post-it note that had been photographed and preserved, the server email that had been printed and certified, a notarized affidavit, the Quarry Creek corporate filings, went into the first. A very different set of documents, the ones Priya had written and discreetly refined over the course of 3 months, went into the second case. The Employee Ownership Trust was executable as soon as I signed it, along with another document bearing my niece Lily's name. Standing over those 2 open cases at midnight, I finally had to run the diagnostic I'd been avoiding all year. When I looked at my own logs, I discovered that every milestone of the previous 10 years, every funding round, every headline, and every 100 new hires, some part of me had presented to an auditor who wasn't in the room. I was in the first row, sitting in the aisle, and my dad was always going over my statistics over a pot roast. At least in part, I had created a $940 million business as an exhibit. Exhibit A in a trial that would never take place in front of a judge who had already decided in a courtroom that only existed in my head. That's what no one tells you about being written out of respect for your family. You may call it ambition to spend your whole life appealing a decision that no one will ever reverse. I want you to let me know in the comments if any of this seems similar, if you've ever found yourself excelling at someone and waiting for a scoreboard in their face to eventually inform you that you were correct. I can assure you that the auditor in your front row isn't worth the seat. It took me 2 open briefcases and 10 years to see mine clearly. Both instances were closed by me. After that, I took up my phone, read my mother's text, that summons without a question mark, and wrote the one appropriate response. I'll be present. I crossed the line that I was unable to uncross when I contacted Priya in the morning. Finalize the trust, I said, everything. Bring me the version I can sign at a dining table, Priya. She paused for a long time, like attorneys do when determining whether to persuade you to do anything. She responded, You're really going to do it in front of them. It's not a query. I informed her that I had been robbed of my companionship at a table in front of my family 10 years before. After the potatoes, it took 20 minutes and was all fairly routine. The next action I took would take place at the same altitude. She refrained from arguing. The paperwork was completed by Thursday. A college trust for Lily, my sister's 9-year-old daughter, funded with $250 and managed by an independent trustee in Columbus, a woman none of us had ever met, was separately enclosed in a plain envelope. And my 70% of Boland Group was fully transferred to an employee ownership trust, benefiting all 34 employees with the bridge loan forgiven at signing. Selected specifically because no one could ever use charm, intimidation, or borrowing against her at that dinner table. If you've been watching this channel for a long time, you are aware that I think the phrase, "who can't touch it," is the most crucial part of any trust contract. I reserved a window seat over the wing on Friday. When I flew out of Dayton with $3,200 in my possession, I had the same cheap feeling. I became aware that I wasn't anxious somewhere over Kansas, and it felt weird, like a tooth missing. I had been practicing arguments for 10 years, but the hearing was never granted. I no longer needed to fight since the hearing had been granted. In April rain, the jet touched down in Dayton. There was no version of this where I slept beneath a quilt my mother sewed in my childhood bedroom, so I booked into a hotel downtown. I spent hours driving the rental throughout my former life on Saturday afternoon. The Wayne Avenue lockup office is now a dentistry facility. I thought it was hilarious that the sign offered free consultations for teeth whitening. I then drove past the Boland Group building and parked in the rain across the street without really choosing to. Even on a Saturday, the lights are on the second story. I could see a dejected rubber plant, desk stations, and a person strolling between them via the huge front windows. And my chest did a complex thing. My 40-year-old sister Meredith is standing next to a young employee's monitor, guiding her through something with the bland patience of someone who has repeatedly told the same thing. She seemed slender. To be honest, she seemed as if she hadn't slept well in a fiscal year. That structure carries 34 salaries, and instead of leaping, my sister, whatever else she is, had remained in it until it sank. To avoid being ambushed at the table, I forced myself to speak the difficult word aloud by myself while sitting in the vehicle with the wipers off and the windshield blurring. My clients were taken by her. She never made up my name either. It wasn't her hand on the post-it. At the age of 30, Mom was afraid of our father and highlighted a legal pad as he cut me out. And all of it is context, none of it is innocent. I returned to the hotel via car, on the bedside table. One more time, my phone buzzed. Once again, my mom. Tomorrow night at 6 o'clock. Put on something pleasant. Everyone is attending. Everybody. My father had already impaneled the jury on my behalf. I deliberately arrived at the Marlowe Street residence 20 minutes ahead of schedule, as I do at every discussion. I didn't ring the bell, though. I could see into the living room via the front window, beyond my mother's lace curtains. And I refrained from pressing the button because of what I saw there. My dad was by himself. He was at the sideboard that houses the family photos. Additionally, he had removed his father's framed picture. Even after 20 years, my grandpa Hayes, the patriarch of the hardware company, remains the most noticeable figure in every area of the home. Dad was carefully using his handkerchief to wipe the glass. The manner in which you polish something that scares you. His lips were moving. I've read lips across enough conference tables to get a sense of its form, even though I couldn't hear it. Pop, I managed to keep it together. It was all held together by something. I didn't recognize his shoulders. He seemed to be a guy who had been dragging a piano upstairs by himself for 50 years, without being allowed to let it down or acknowledge its weight. And just as I had spent 10 years practicing for my father, I stood in the rain and watched my father practice for his own father. The chain extended beyond my complaint. It always does. Since comprehension is a solvent, I want to exercise caution. Additionally, it dissolves items that should remain solid if you pour enough of it. I will thus repeat what I said to myself on that porch. I can see what was done to him. What he did with it remains unchanged. Comprehending is not an excuse. The dining room was set up for a formal event, and when I rang the bell, my mother answered it with a full-blown church grin and exclaimed, "There's my girl." Even the welcome had a deed attached. The water goblets, the wedding china, the tablecloth reserved for Easter and funerals, 9-place configurations. Lily, with her library books sneaked into her lap, was positioned between Meredith and Doug, my mother at his right, and my father at the head. Aunt Ruth, my Springfield-side cousins Gary and Bate. An empty chair for me at the foot of the table, right across from my father, which I noticed in the same way you noted a rifle over a fireplace, and a pot roast in the middle of everything on the nice platter. 10 years earlier, I was voted out of my own life at a shareholder meeting across town as the same meal was cooling on the same table. Coincidence is not something my mother believes in. She thinks menus are important. Small chat, akin to gentle questioning, preceded dinner. The market has treated you well, according to my father, carving. A statement designed to make $940 million seem like the weather I had experienced. Gary wanted to know whether I knew any actual hackers. When 9-year-old Lily, the only person at the table with clean hands, looked up from her lap and inquired whether I had ever captured a criminal, I said, "Yes, sweetheart, a few." I then felt the envelope with her name sitting in my case like a hot coal. Meredith didn't say much. Her wine glass drained more quickly than anybody else. She rearranged food on her plate without glancing at me, and I saw that she was in the position of someone anticipating a planned catastrophe. She was aware of what was about to happen. She was told to bring a presentation. My father then put down the cutting knife, tapped his glass of water with one knuckle, and got up. He stated, "I want to talk about family and business while we're all together." I'll give him this after he spoke for 6 minutes. The speech was excellent. He described how the Hay name had withstood difficult times for 3 generations. He spoke about loyalty as if it were a crop that the family had always cultivated. He used the phrase "we" in 14 distinct ways, all of which meant me. The room leaned in with him as he reached the request. He described Boland Group as an excellent business going through a difficult time, underappreciated, and full of wonderful people. And here was Stella, fortunate enough to be able to do what her family did. Bring the companies together. Bring Boland Group under her protection. Put actual money in her sister's favor. Keep the cash in its proper place. "Where it belongs," he said again, gazing at me with the kind, sensible eyes of a man who has never examined himself. Meredith looked at her dish as if it owed her money, and my mother stroked her necklace and said, "It's what families do." Doug's knee bounced under the table. After a period of stillness, I looked at my father, who was standing there with his glass halfway up. And I didn't feel angry. It was acknowledgement. The ledger had only been rebalanced by a $940 million item on my end. This was the same voice that remarked, "Nothing personal. Paper is paper." The ledger now requested that its funds be sent home. 10 years, and the math had not flinched. I folded my napkin, put down my fork, and posed the inquiry for which I had traveled 1,200 miles. I turned to my sister before responding, "Dad, one thing," and said, "Meredith, who owns your company right now." The color fled her face in a manner I've only seen in emergency rooms. "What?" she asked. Gentleness was the only weapon I had told myself I would use, so I asked again softly, "Who owns your business? You retained 30%. Who has the remainder?" She stared at Dad, saw nothing, and spoke as if she were a witness. In November, a holding firm purchased us out of the bank workout, Quarry Creek. a Colorado-based investing organization. They've never even been introduced to us. It's all done by attorneys. She came to a halt. I saw the word Colorado catch up to her. I turned to face her after reaching inside my first case and placing a small paper on the tablecloth. It had the Quarry Creek Holdings formation documents, the acquisitions signing page, and my name, my actual wet ink signature above the title, sole member. I introduced myself as Quarry Creek. 5 months ago, I purchased Boland Group. The $400,000 that keeps your salary going is my bridge loan, and I control 70% of it. I could hear the grandfather clock in the hallway pondering as the table became silent. Doug made a hiccup-like sound. With the calculated calm of a lady acquiring a front-row seat, Ruth set down her fork. And I want you to see this the way I did, Dad. After being surprised for precisely 3 seconds, my father's expression changed dramatically. It blossomed. He stretched both arms like a preacher at a baptism and laughed heartily. That's all then, he bellowed. The family already has it. You beat me to it, Stella, my dear. He lifted his glass to the table. He honestly believed that this was excellent news. At that moment, I realized that speech could never reach the bottom. I then put the gray box on the table and stopped talking. Dad, there's another item that came with the business. With the label facing him, I placed it next to the pot roast. 2016 Client Transitions. Everyone in the room read it together. With the 40 original letters spread in their sleeves, I lifted the top and started arranging the contents like place cards in the middle of the table. Every customer I ever had was notified in writing, signed by me, that I was leaving them. However, I have never in my life signed one of them. This is a scan of my signature from a 40 times printed insurance modification. Every page has the same ghost and tilt. I put down the picture of the post-it with his handwriting enlarged and filled the frame. Make use of the March signature page. FH, your guidance. I made the server email certified. One day, Stella will comprehend what you've spoken. I put down the affidavit of Dale Mercer, the manager of your office. He thought someone ought to, so he retained a copy. With their jaws hanging wide, my cousins were passing the letters. Like a judge who has been waiting 39 years for the proper case, Ruth read the post-it and nodded slowly once. After that, I removed the stack of unmailed envelopes with rubber bands, and I remained silent. I just moved across the table, placed them in front of my mom, and allowed her to see her own handwriting. She raised her hand to her lips. One by one, everyone in the room realized what they were seeing as they followed her gaze. At that moment, I heard my father's voice break in public for the first time in my life. First, denial. Justification is needed since something is out of context. At last, both of my hands were flat on the table as I was defending this family. The reality of Sunday attire. You had no idea what I was lugging. I held off until he was done. I'm not here for the company, Dad, I responded, keeping my composure. Fine, my father responded, his voice now gravelly. I don't want it back, I want it true. The ledger is frantically searching for a balanced page. Fine, you own it, congratulations. Take the company, that's what you came for, isn't it? Call the loan, do it. Show everyone what you flew here to do. Every face at the table turned to face me, and I could see that they all knew what was going to happen because they had all grown up in the same mathematical environment. The powerful one squeezes now. I start the second case instead. I came here via plane to do this. Priya's paperwork arrived tabbed and bound. On the Easter tablecloth and at my mother's burial, I uncapped my pen and signed my 70% stake in Boland Group into Employee Ownership Trust. All employees, including the 12 I employed myself a lifetime ago, received every share. The $400,000 bridge loan forgiveness was signed by me. I moved the package to Meredith by sliding it down the table. Your folks now on the firm. Who oversees it is decided by the trust board. If they decide to retain you, you'll be the first Hayes in 3 generations to be employed because someone picked you. She didn't dab at her eyes. She just gave me the same expression as when the weather changes too quickly to wear appropriate clothing. I then placed the last envelope in front of Lily. For your college, my love. In a trust, it belongs to you. No adult at this table is allowed to touch it, and it is guarded by a lady in Columbus. Not one. I returned my father's sentence, which I had been carrying for 10 years like shrapnel that was too deep to cut out, as I stared up at him, still standing with my hands flat on the wood. Dad, you were correct. I never had that one. It's this one. I got up after thanking my mom for supper. Before I heard her chair scrape back, I reached the front door. I turned as my mother followed me out onto the porch into the light April rain because, even at that age, a part of me was still 8 years old and full of hope. She crossed her arms to protect herself from the chill as she stood under the porch light. Why couldn't you just let us have this? We're your family, my mother said, not saying, I'm sorry, that I should have told you. Even now, with her own handwriting on the tablecloth behind her, the story she reached for was the one where I had taken something from them. The ledger was the only language left in that house, and in the ledger's grammar, the truth itself was an asset I had selfishly refused to write off. I stared at her for a long time while the lace curtains glowed behind her. I paid for the truth, Mom. I used my own funds to repurchase it. You just watched me carry it twice. She opened her mouth, and I will never know what she was going to say because Meredith appeared in the doorway behind her, pale, holding the trust packet against her chest like a life vest. And my sister's lips moved around something that had waited 10 years. The letters. I knew about thee, and no sound came out. I nodded at her once so she'd know the sentence was received anyway. Then I walked down the steps my father had poured the summer I was born, got in the rental car, and drove back to the hotel through the wet streets of a town that used to know me wrong. I sat by the hotel window for a long time that night, watching Dayton shine wet and orange under the street lights, and I waited to feel the thing I had assumed would come. Triumph or grief, or the urge to call someone and narrate it. None of it came. What came instead was quiet, an enormous, unfamiliar quiet, like a server room after you finally locate the failing fan. Around 11, my phone lit up. Ruth 1987 finally lost one, it said, and then a minute later, your grandmother would have liked you. The family group chat, the one I had been silently reading for years without posting, said nothing at all. No eruption, no defense of Dad, no version control war over what had happened at that table. Silence, which in my family is not peace, just inventory. I opened the chat settings and left the group. I didn't block anyone. I just stopped holding a seat in a room where my name had always been a line item. And sitting there, I finally audited the 10 years honestly. I hadn't built Kestrel Ridge despite that dinner table. I had built a great deal of it for that dinner table. Brick by brick, an appeal filed year after year to a court that was never in session. Tonight I had walked into the courtroom, presented the whole case, won it on the merits in front of the only jury with jurisdiction, and discovered in the same breath that I no longer needed the verdict. The auditor's chair in my front row was finally empty. My mother's text had said, no excuses, and she was right, though not the way she meant it. I had had enough of justifying them. I slept the whole way on the morning trip home to Denver, something I hadn't done in 10 years. I promised you quantifiable reality, not pyrotechnics, so here's what the damage really looks like 3 months later. Boland Group is now controlled by the Employee Trust. The healthiest statement in this narrative, in my opinion, is that the workers decided to name it Right Line Services after the river and the brothers without consulting anybody. At the June Trust Board meeting, Meredith was retained as general manager on merit with a 1-year review. This means that my sister, who is 40 years old, is the first member of our family to maintain a position solely because the people she supervises choose to keep her. In July, she wrote me a 1-page handwritten note. It said that she had been aware of the letters since 2016, that she had convinced herself that her father decided to make the decision, and that she was sorry, all without any qualifying words. I responded with a single sentence, manage it effectively, and I really did mean it. That isn't a reconciliation. Accurate accounting is only getting started. Furthermore, correct accounting is important in my family. At the golf course, my father recounts a different tale. Ruth provides a report. According to his account, he made a difficult choice in 2016 that saved employment, and I paid the family back with a dinner stunt. Until he passes away, he will tell it that way. The guys he plays golf with will nod, and none of them will question why his daughter chose to give him a corporation instead of giving him $1. I don't need them to ask anymore. As if the envelope in front of her at that table were written by another lady, my mother sends cards with identical loops and postage. I haven't opened them yet. A boundary doesn't have to be ablaze, so I placed them in an unopened shoebox. Lily's fund is quietly growing in Columbus under the watchful eye of a trustee who, according to what I've been informed, has already turned down a call from my father, costing her nothing since she owes him nothing. Additionally, I now conduct a free evening session for female entrepreneurs at Kestrel Ridge on the first Thursday of each month. The first lesson is always the same. I display them on the whiteboard from my former garage as we read a convertible note together, clause by clause. It is displayed in our lobby. The first thing you notice is the precise location where love signs its name. Occasionally, people carefully inquire as to whether I regret the money, the company's price, the debt forgiveness, and the fund that were all used to purchase back a truth that the courts had already abandoned. I ultimately tell them what I know. The only thing that can't be taken, transformed, or signed away by someone else is the demonstrated capacity to begin with nothing and make it real. Thus, whatever they were able to take from me was never valuable. That's my tale. 40 letters I never signed, 1 yellow post-it note, and 1 signature I decided to give away. If this prompted you to stop evaluating your own value on someone else's ledger, or to read every condition before taking money from someone you love, consider it a message and do it this week, not tomorrow. Show this video to someone who continues to carry a false conviction. Tell me your tale in a comment. Click subscribe, and I'll see you in the next.